Welcome back to my vessel of lie. Tonight we begin with a switch that works in a room that refuses brightness. Every light in the house obeys, except one, and the reason points toward fear of change. Mara Ives moved into the brick corner flat after a long winter ended. Morning touched her plants kindly. Evening softened the kitchen. Hallways breathed quiet. Only the back room stayed dim like a held breath. The bulb was new, the wiring checked, the breaker fine. The switch clicked confidently, yet the center of the room stayed darker than its edges, like a lake that keeps its depth secret in sunlight. Mara stood in the doorway and listened to the silence. The air felt cooler by a degree and slower by an intention. Not haunted, not dangerous, simply unwilling to cooperate with hurry or certainty. She wrote a list titled Simple Fixes and tried them: brighter bulb, second lamp, curtain open, curtain tied, mirror placed to borrow light. The outline improved a little, the middle kept declining invitations without malice. An electrician named Caleb brought a meter and a patient voice. He mapped the circuit and smiled. The load looks perfect. Nothing wrong. Sometimes rooms teach pace better than people, he said, then packed his tools again. Mara laughed politely and replaced the shade with linen. She cleaned the baseboards, swept the floor, and promised to leave the room alone for a day. Promises have weight. This one measured about one afternoon. The next morning, she found footprints of light across the rug, narrow rectangles shaped by the fire escape. The pattern reached almost to the center and then stopped, as if the day changed its mind mid-stride. She placed a chair where the sun paused and sat without fixing anything. 10 breaths in and 10 breaths out. The room did not brighten, but her shoulders lowered into a position that helps light notice people. On the wall, she found a hairline crack shaped like a coastline. She traced it with one finger. The plaster felt tired. She whispered hello silently. Some repairs begin by admitting relationship before choosing materials and timing. She brought a shallow bowl of water and a small fern, sets of green that practice patience every hour. The fern leaned toward the pale light like a student. The water mirrored the window square with humble accuracy. At night, the room turned cool again. The switch still worked. Brightness reached the corners. The middle kept the velvet of dusk. Mara placed a notebook at the threshold and wrote one sentence: practice arrival without fixing first. The next afternoon, she unpacked the last boxes. One labeled later and one labeled maybe. Later weighed twice as much, maybe rattled gently. She carried neither into the dark room. Boundaries help light learn where to land reliably. A neighbor named Yuda knocked with a housewarming plant and a story. He said the prior owner used the back room for music practice. He said the room liked repetition. He said nothing about broken bulbs or stubborn spirits. Mara stood in the doorway that evening and tapped a soft rhythm on her leg. 4 and 6, arrival and release. The rhythm steadied her breath. She waited until impatience softened, then left the light on while she cooked. Steam from the pot drifted into the hallway like small weather. She carried 2 bowls to the table and felt the house decide she belonged. Belonging often arrives between tasks, unnoticed, exactly when you are not trying to deserve it. Later she returned and noticed the center no longer swallowed brightness completely. It kept a darker color, but not a wall. She moved the chair one hand width closer. She moved the lamp one hand width gentler. She wrote 3 lines for the corkboard: water before screens, light before conclusions, kindness before speed. These lines looked like switches for days, small toggles that rerouted current. The room approved without applause by not resisting her feet. Saturday rain arrived and the building changed tone. Stairwells sounded like wood instruments. The kitchen sounded like copper. The back room sounded like a drum waiting for careful hands. Mara entered and sat, listening until her breathing learned the tempo. She opened the navy box at the threshold and found a sketchbook, a photograph of a bridge, and a folded letter to herself from last year. The letter named 3 half-finished beginnings and 1 postponed goodbye. She did not read it fully. She placed the letter under the chair leg to stop a wobble. Some words help more by supporting fewer words. The chair steadied and the room accepted a smaller argument, ending quietly. On Sunday, she wiped the window with slow circles. Dust let go like old opinions. Outside, a tree offered moving shadows that crossed the floor like whispers. The pattern drifted toward the center, then rested a respectful distance away. Mara invited the pattern to visit again tomorrow by leaving the curtain tied to the side. She adjusted nothing else. The fern marked time with quiet new green. The bowl of water reflected passing clouds like simple miracles practicing humility. A week later, her friend Priya visited with oranges and a question. How is the room that resists? Mara said it prefers honesty and rhythm. Priya nodded. Resistance often retreats when it meets pacing rather than pressure. They sat for 15 minutes and named what would remain even if everything changed. The name you answer to gently, the river path, the neighbor who waves, the sound of keys, the recipe you know by memory and breath. The room listened as if grating without red ink. The darkness thinned again by a shade between colors. Not proof, practice. Mara stood at the center line and decided to move the rug fully inside as a declaration without a trumpet. She slid the rug forward and felt a click in her chest. A hinge releasing, she turned the switch and watched the ceiling light meet the floor light without argument. Still softer in the middle, now willing to negotiate terms respectfully. That night, she dreamed of her grandmother in a workshop of lamps, each one lit by attention rather than electricity. Her grandmother handed her a small tag that read, "Begin smaller, finish kinder, rest before you repair," then smiled like a solved riddle. Morning brought a colder wind and a sharper doubt. Mara entered the room anyway and found nothing dramatic. Just a steady invitation to continue. She wrote a second sentence in the notebook. Tend to death without rushing the surface into imitation. Caleb returned with a final invoice and asked whether the problem persisted. Mara said the room prefers cooperative pace. He laughed and said that is outside warranty but inside wisdom. Then he left a spare bulb anyway, like a blessing. She placed the spare bulb on the bookshelf and noticed a short book about habits she had never finished. She opened to a chapter on thresholds. Thresholds decide whether change feels like violence or welcome. She underlined 3 lines with a dull pencil. Afternoon light reached farther than last week and touched the fern. The fern answered with another small unfurling. She whispered good work to leaves and meant herself. Feedback works when it honors effort rather than demanding spectacle. When exhaustion visited, she did not negotiate. She sat in the chair with eyes closed and counted gentle 4 and 6. The darkness did not threaten, it held. A container large enough for breath to relearn its job description. A delivery arrived addressed to the previous owner, a small box of metronomes. Inside a note said practice makes timing honest. She wound one and let it tick in the doorway. The room kept time without rushing anyone out of themselves. Days layered like thin paper, the center accepted more light slowly. She pulled the later box closer and opened it carefully. Inside were unsent letters, a map, and a resignation she had written, but never mailed when certainty felt expensive. She read the resignation and smiled. "Not this time," she said without speaking. "Staying can be change also." She slid the paper under the bowl of water to protect the table. Permission does ordinary jobs when invited kindly. She began hosting a small circle on Tuesdays for neighbors who wanted new rhythms. They spoke about fear of change without pretending courage always feels brave. The room held the stories without swallowing them. That was the difference now. Holding, not hiding. On Wednesday, she found a tiny draft near the baseboard. She sealed it with putty and patience. Small cold can make large doubt. After sealing it, she noticed her shoulders stop guarding themselves against a wind that had been more habit than air. Late that night, the neighborhood lost power for a minute. The apartment went dark everywhere. The back room felt no different than the others. When lights returned, the difference remained gone. Equal night had reset loyalty across rooms and ordinary electricity. Mara wrote a third sentence in the notebook. "Light is most useful when I can still hear myself breathe inside it." She closed the cover and placed the notebook at the exact center of the rug. The next morning, she moved the chair 2 hand widths inward. The fern now sat where the darkness once insisted on winning. Nothing fought, everything negotiated. That is how good change behaves when you're allowed to remain yourself while moving. She brewed tea and carried a cup for the room as if it were a guest with its own preferences. She set the cup on the windowsill and watched steam write temporary letters on glass. Unsent messages that still matter precisely because they evaporate. Her friend Yuta returned to borrow a ladder and paused at the threshold. He said the room finally looks honest, not brighter, truer. He asked what solved it. Mara said timing and breath. Then she handed him the ladder and waved. She replaced one frame on the wall with a small mirror, not to multiply brightness, to multiply witness. Rooms behave better when they can see themselves learning. The mirror returned her posture gently corrected. She adjusted shoulders and kept the correction without scolding. On Fridays, she wrote a short list for weekends: walk before screens, stretch before opinions, cook before cravings, invite before isolating. The list looked ordinary and felt like electricity rooted through kindness. The light agreed by simply working without comment. A quiet storm visited again, and the building hummed in lower keys. Mara played the metronome and tapped time on the chair arm. When the storm ended, the room kept steady rather than snapping back to old weather. Evidence accumulates like trustworthy bricks. She finally opened the music app and practiced scales she'd abandoned years ago. Mistakes sounded like small rain on metal. Nobody corrected her. The room offered patience as accompaniment. She laughed in the snow and kept going. That laugh mattered most. One afternoon, she noticed the bowl had emptied slowly. She refilled it and thought about maintenance. Everything alive prefers maintenance over miracles, lights and leaves and lungs. Her calendar began to reflect this preference. Fewer dramatic fixes and more small, faithful care. The invisible coastline crack looked softer after weeks of quiet attention. She filled it with lightweight compound and smoothed the line with a practice card. She did not paint it yet. The room had earned a scar that reminded them both of progress. By month's end, she barely remembered the first darkness. She remembered the posture it demanded instead. Honest arrival, measured changes, unperformed courage, trustworthy pauses. The light now lived in the middle as well as the edges and did not negotiate its existence anymore. She invited Priya and Yuta to mark the turning. They brought bread and strawberries. They ate on the floor and let the metronome tick like a small clock that believed them. Laughter sounded normal again. Normal is a beautiful destination after a long misunderstanding. Mara stood at the center and turned the switch once more. On and off. Both worked. The reason the room stayed dark had never been the switch. It had been her pace. The room refused rush for her protection. If you are standing at a threshold where brightness hesitates, consider that your switch may be fine. What needs practice is permission. Try one patient adjustment, one honest breath, one schedule that fits your nervous system better than your ambition. Fear of change speaks loudly when we sprint. It becomes practical when we walk. Let the room inside you notice consistent attention. Not dramatic promises. Light prefers showing up where you stayed long enough to introduce yourself kindly and keep your name. Thank you for being here with my vessel of light. If this story kept you steady, like the video so the candle travels further. Subscribe to my vessel of light, and share one small change you will practice this week in your own honest room.